have Dr. Dan Berger from the University of Washington, Bothell here today. And it's really appropriate what Dan's going to be speaking about because what kicked us off at the beginning of the semester was looking at prisons and gang violence in Central America with Anthony Fontes at American University. And so now we're going kind of full circle to looking at some of those same issues, but looking at it within the domestic context. So we're very happy to have Dan here to talk about prisons, policy, and profit, ending the crisis of mass incarceration. Let me give you a little bit of a biography of Dr. Berger, and then I'll turn the floor over to him. He's an associate professor of comparative ethnic studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. He's author or editor of 6 books, including Captive Nation, Black Prison, Organizing the Civil Rights Era, which was a winner of a 2005 James Rawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians. Dr. Berger's work is truly interdisciplinary. It draws on lots of different traditions to kind of examine this particular issue. And we were just talking about his next project, which even sounds even more kind of cutting edge. So we're very happy for him to be here. And so I will turn the floor to Dr. Dan Berger.
Thank you all so much for coming, even if it's only extra credit that we need to get. Very excited to be here. I really appreciate Dr. Berger's introduction and invitation, as well as the support of the PJHR and the various sponsoring departments. So thank you. I went to high school in Boca Raton, so it feels extra weird to be here, but I'm delighted. I want to talk about mass incarceration, which I think is one of the most significant human rights issues of our time, one of the most urgent human rights issues of our time. And I want to talk about what it is, because I think there's a lot that we think that it is, some of which I think we can complicate, not for the purposes of kind of intellectual edification, but actually to understand what mass incarceration actually is, like where it lives, how it breathes, how it is sustained. And then, as the subtitle promises, what it would mean to end it, right? And to not live in a country that has the world's highest incarceration rate. So there are some charts like this that I'm sure many of you have seen before that are sort of one way to represent, right, the kind of changes that have happened in the U.S. in the last 5 decades in particular, right, that have given, as I said, the U.S. the world's highest incarceration rate, but also the most people in prison, right? So not just the rate of incarceration, but actually whole numbers. Right? And we have 1 to 2.2 million people in prison. There's sort of no other country that even comes close to that. Now, obviously, it's not just the size of it, right, but the actual lived experience where almost the totality of people who are in prisons, jails, and detention centers around the country are poor. A majority of them are Black or Latinx. And so this is a very concentrated, right, form of violence and domination. When we talk about, right, that dramatic growth, to give some sense of the substance, in 1900 there were about 57,000 people in prison. In 1980, about 300,000 people. In 2000, there's 2 million. So we're talking about a very rapid and dramatic growth. And they're incarcerated, right? When we talk about mass incarceration, we're often sort of talking about it as if it's this one thing that lives in one place. We're actually talking about a sort of vast archipelago of prisons, jails, and detention centers scattered throughout the country, right? And the differences between prisons and jails we can talk more about in the Q&A, but and detention centers, which I mostly won't be talking about today. But the differences are significant for what it means to actually end mass incarceration. One of the main things that I hope you take away from this is that there's tremendous regional variation when we're talking about mass incarceration and we're talking about the carceral state. Most of my research focuses on carcerality in the West Coast, in California, and now I've been working on a digital project in Washington State, where I live. And I want to acknowledge that Florida has, and I know there are people in this room who work much more in Florida than I do, right? Florida has a higher incarceration rate than the US, which has a higher incarceration rate than anywhere else in the country. Right? So these issues are particularly significant in Florida. And again, it's not just the size that we're talking about, it's the meanness, right? It's the cruelty. So last year at the at the talk of a strike happening inside some Florida prisons, the state locked down all 97,000 people incarcerated, right? Couldn't leave their cells to prevent even talk of a strike. More recently, Governor Scott, just a few months ago, tried to balance the budget on the backs of incarcerated people, right? By stopping necessary health programs, drug treatment programs, religious programs, libraries, and literacy access. Right? So it's, as prisons got bigger, they got meaner. Right? And in fact, actually, a lot of my work has shown that prisons got meaner first. And it was the extension of meanness that precipitated the growth in scale. Right? Something that we'll unpack a little bit more. I want to give just kind of a provisional outline here of what we're talking about. Okay. So we're talking about the US incarceration. My colleague Toussaint Lozier and I have described this as three models of imprisonment. Okay. The first model is what we call the workhouse model. This is the idea of prison slave labor, right? And it's sort of most evident in the use of the convict leasing system and the chain gang system after slavery. But the thing about the workhouse model is that it's a national model of incarceration. Okay. Alongside and during time of slavery, you had this prison slavery in the North. Okay. This idea that it was okay to make incarcerated people work for free, often doing quite dangerous jobs, has actually been a kind of foundational problem of the United States. So prisoners in California built the first prison in California, right? They had to build their own house of confinement. Right? Similar things existed in similar kind of prison factories in New York, Ohio, Washington, and other places. So the first thing that's important to understand is when we talk about the history of prison slave labor, right, and the ways that it has been racist and brutal, but this is a national problem, not simply a southern one. The second model, right, is the kind of big house model, what we call the big house model. This is the idea of the kind of rehabilitative prison. Right? The prisons are there to sort of teach people who did wrong how to do better. Right? Most reductive form. And this is actually has never really existed, right, in form, because it turns out that putting someone in a cage and removing them from friends and family and loved ones and communities is a poor model for actually producing better results. Right? But even to the extent that it had ever existed, this kind of rehabilitative ideal has existed for the shortest time. Right? This sort of model has the shortest history within the history of US prisons. And what the era of mass incarceration has mostly been characterized by is what we call the warehouse model of incarceration. Right? And the warehouse model has, I think, two distinguishing features. Right? And again, it's that balance of bigness and meanness that I spoke about. On the one hand, we have these tremendously overcrowded prisons, right? That are, I'm still getting used to the humidity here. That are sort of structurally overcrowded. Right? There was a very significant Supreme Court case a number of years ago in California where the Supreme Court, it came out of California, but the US Supreme Court ruled that California had to reduce its prison population to 137% capacity. Right? So 137%, so 37% over what they were built for was an agreeable form of overcrowding. Right? But they were about 30,000 people above that. Right? This picture's from California, but you have the same kind of overcrowding that is a sort of structural feature of the prison system exists in many prison systems around the country. But the other aspect of the warehouse model is not just that there are a lot of people that are crammed on top of each other, right? And the ways that works against the kind of forms of solidarity that incarcerated people have formed at various moments. But the other aspect of the warehouse model is the growth of long-term and even permanent solitary confinement. So you have these sort of isolation cells like this, where people spend 23 or 24 hours a day locked in a cell, removed from any community contact, under often video surveillance, as you see from the camera in the corner here. And And this too, right, has been a sort of product of the era of mass incarceration. Right? This is what sort of ushered in. So again, it's the meanness, right, as well as the bigness that are distinctive here. So the question then becomes why? Right? How do we get to this place where we have locked up so many poor people of color, right? And particularly in the last half century. So one thing that people and critics often point to is the 13th Amendment. As I hope all of you know, the 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolished slavery, right? Passed in 1865. That said neither slavery nor voluntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, shall, where the person has been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. And so this was a tremendous win, right, to abolish slavery, and yet it contained what people call, right, the sort of loophole. Now, why this loophole? Right? And what does that loophole have to do with mass incarceration? Those are, I think, sort of separate questions. But if you remember the chart that we started with, right, you don't get mass incarceration until the 1970s. The 13th Amendment is passed before this chart even begins. Right? The 13th Amendment comes over here. So we can't say, right, that this amendment passed 150 years ago controls the kind of policies that have happened in the last 50 years. We also want to just sort of pause parenthetically because I think we've had a number of, in some cases, cynical misuses of the 13th Amendment, in some cases, sort of sincere misappropriations. Right? The reason why the 13th Amendment contained that exclusion was not just the kind of shrewd move by slaveholders to maintain their power, right? Although we love that. The reason for it is that prison slavery existed nationwide, right? So the Union, right, the very side that sort of fought to end the Civil War, a number of states had prison slave labor, right? A number of elites in those states believed that putting incarcerated people to work was an acceptable form of punishment. It was an acceptable use of incarceration. And so the 13th Amendment reflects, right, a kind of pitiful, terrifying state of how American elites have always thought about prison and what the purpose of prison is. But we needed something else to get mass incarceration, right? Because that kind of historic cruelty of prison existed for a very long time. So if it's not just the 13th Amendment, right, is it then private prisons? I think we are often so used to the fact that major corporations will find ways to exploit people's misery, right? Or to exploit people's sincere desires. I won't ask you about your student loans, right? But I'm imagining many of you have student loans to be able to come here, and you're acquainted, right, with how private companies can look to make a quick buck. So is that what's happening in prison? Now, certainly we have, right, a tremendous growth in the number of private prisons in the late 20th century, which had not really existed since the late 19th century. Right? For most of the 20th century, there wasn't a thing called private prisons. So we had this tremendous growth, right? That's really significant, and yet that growth is a pittance of the overall growth of incarceration. Private prisons grow because prisons grow, right? They're not the kind of driving factor that's sending, ultimately, right, 2.2 million people to prison. And even that number is kind of misleading, right? Because it's like 1.5 million people in prison, and about 750,000 people in jails at any given day. But 10 million people pass in and out of jails in a given year. Most of these institutions are government run. And I can't stress that enough, right? Because that's why the question of policy and politics is so fundamental. Private enterprise attaches itself to what state actors are already doing. So that's the case with the sort of private prison industry, right? You can see, again, just another way of representing the same point. This lineal line all the way down at the bottom of the chart, you can barely see, right? That's the growth of private prisons. This big orange jump, that's government-run incarceration. Most people, the vast majority of people, are incarcerated in government-run prisons. So when we're talking about prisons, we're talking about mass incarceration, we're talking about why that happened, we're talking about what state actors do and why. I want to acknowledge, when we're talking about private prisons, right, that there is tremendous regional variation. So about half the country doesn't have any private prisons. Of the half that does, most of them have one or two, and only a handful of states have more than one. Right? Florida is one of those handfuls, right? So you all have your work cut out for you in Florida, on a number of levels, but I'm sure that's not news to you. But the other reason why I think it's important to sort of expand our horizon beyond just private prisons is that it misses how money does move through the prison system. Right? By just assuming that everything is happening at the level of these privately run facilities. Because there's a lot of money that does move through prison systems. Okay? But it's largely moving through government-run institutions, and it's largely state money, it's largely public money. Right? It's taxpayer money. Or it's bonds that states take out on behalf of taxpayers, right, to build and maintain prisons. So let's think about this empirically. Right, the two biggest private prison companies are the GEO Group and what is now called Core Civic, what used to be called the Corrections Corporation of America. And they account for almost 3/4 of private prisons in the country, right? And also most of immigrant detention centers. And their profits in 2014 were about $3 billion. Those profits are not just from private prisons, right? They're also from security, policing, surveillance. These are sort of multifaceted sort of criminal justice enterprises and global, right? So that's their profit total, not just from private prisons. That same year, California alone had a budget of $9 billion on its prison system. We think about one of the most kind of pernicious aspects of criminal justice policy in the last 30 years, the civil asset forfeiture, which gives police or prosecutors the ability to seize things that you have on your person or that are in your possession if you get arrested. That's $4.5 billion, right? Of simply agents of the state taking your stuff, right? Your cars, your cash, your house, whatever the case may be. A lot more money moving through those aspects, right? All for public aspects. But then there's a number of other private actors, right, besides private prison companies who are significant players in bilking incarcerated people and their family members. So the private bail industry is one example. Okay? Commissary and phone calls is another, right? Which those companies, right, make about as much as the private prison companies do. But their work is much more pervasive. So every prison partners with a company like one of these, right, to maintain its communications system. So this is often the only way that people who are in prison have of maintaining connection with their family or loved ones, is through mail, through phone calls, through email, which is allowed in some places. Okay? And then Aramark is a food distribution company, right, that provides a lot of food to prison. This is where money is moving through prison far more consequentially than private prisons, right? Because you can talk to most people who are in prison or who have been in prison that have never stepped foot in a privately run facility. And yet they or their family members have paid a lot of money to Securus to get a phone call or an email, right? They paid a lot of money to Aramark to sort of buy food from the commissary, right? Those sort of high markup fees that happen throughout those are sort of legendary. Smart communications, I want to just give a shout out to for a minute. I used to live in Pennsylvania. I still pay pretty close attention to what happens in Pennsylvania. And about 6 weeks ago, the state of Pennsylvania, in response to what they thought were drugs getting into prison, And usually most things that come into prison come in through staff because they have the easiest access. But the guards, so trying to protest a number of prisoner rights claims, said that they thought they were coming in through the mail, and so the state shut down all mail going into prisons across the whole state, and they partnered with Smart Communications, so that now if you send a letter to someone in prison in Pennsylvania, it needs to come to Florida, where Smart Communications is based, and be scanned, and then Smart Communications will send the scan back to the prison. So this is a tremendous violation of privacy. People are not having access to the physical things, right? The pictures that are being sent, as well as the letters that are being sent to prison. Part of why that's important is that Smart Communications has a multi-million-dollar contract with the state of Pennsylvania to do that, right? That's Pennsylvania money that's coming to Florida so that people in Pennsylvania can't have access to their family members, right? And that's not something that we can boycott our way out of, right? Because none of us, if you're not incarcerated and you don't know people who's incarcerated, we can boycott Smart Communications, right? Because they partner with prison systems. They partner with state-based prison systems. So what that means, right, in all of these cases is that we need to be focused on the state, right? That's why a number of analysts working on in the field of prisons and critical prison studies try to talk about not just mass incarceration, but the carceral state, right? What is the kind of state apparatus and the state way of thinking that gives us such punitive results, right? So prison is a political problem, not an economic one. There are many ways where we can start this story, but I think one particularly significant one for our purposes in thinking about how we get so many people in prison so quickly begins in the mid-1960s. Okay? Barry Goldwater is the Republican candidate for president. He runs what now we would call a very Trumpian campaign, premised on highly punitive response to the civil rights movement. It's very open and occasionally dimly veiled racism, and says law and order is the main issue. Right? Goldwater campaigns one of the most reactionary presidential campaigns of the time, right? Unimaginable for many even Republicans at the time, and he loses in a historic landslide. He wins his own state in 1964. So Johnson, right, the kind of liberal Democrat who developed the Civil Rights Act, passed the Civil Rights Act, shortly after office passed the Voting Rights Act, comes in with tremendous mandate. Right? Most of the country has rejected Goldwater conservatism and rejected this idea of sort of law and order governance. And a year after coming into office, in addition to signing the Voting Rights Act, Johnson launches the war on crime. That war on crime is, whenever politicians declare war, we should take it seriously, right? It's more than a metaphor, it's a mobilization of resources. Okay? And that war on crime gives us mass incarceration, right? It gives us the things that we often, analysts often focus more on, which is the war on drugs, right? which comes about several years later. But the war on crime is where it begins, because it mobilizes the federal government into saying, crime is a problem, prisons need to be modernized, and the way they are modernized is by growing bigger, by hiring more guards, by hiring more police. Right? And that gives us a kind of perpetual, seemingly never-ending set of wars on drugs, on gangs, on terrorism, etc. Right? That foundational moment from the mid-1960s, from one of the most liberal presidents the US has ever had, then takes a very easy and quick right turn, right? Because the sort of apparatus of warfare is an apparatus of the war on crime is an inherently conservative enterprise, right? It's sort of governed through crime, as legal scholar John Confinement puts it. And so that governance through crime helped propel Richard Nixon to success 4 years later in a very narrow presidential victory. Right? but also premised on this sort of law and order campaign that is then extrapolated, right, far more significantly from Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and built into the 1990s. Right? And so mass incarceration, which I think we should sort of see as a kind of right-wing prison reform, has been a bipartisan effort from the beginning. Right? Tremendous sort of agreement among the two major parties. They may disagree on the details, right, but the basic logic of governing through crime and governing through prison expansion and police expansion has been a shared project. What that means in practice is, particularly in the beginning, in the 1960s and 1970s, tremendous violence in the streets. Right? The deployment of increasingly armed police forces, the initiation of SWAT teams, right, which began after the Watts Rebellion in 1965, and the first deployment of a SWAT team after it was first created was against the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles. Right? A tremendous mobilization of growing police authority that then is sort of bolstered by growing prosecutorial authority, right, to charge people with more so that they can go to prison for longer. And so beginning with that, right, with the mobilization of police power and prosecutorial power, it's not long before we then need to embark on the biggest prison construction boom in world history. So that political problem then metastasizes, right? So that the government can only think through prison. And again, this kind of bipartisan project serves conservative ends. So I was delighted to see the passage of Amendment 4 here in Florida during the election. I wanted to put up this map which just shows the severity of the disenfranchisement of African Americans, largely through the criminal justice system during the 2016 election. Right? Because disenfranchisement, as well as prison gerrymandering, which we'll talk about in a second, have swung a number of elections. Right? So that the whole conversation about red state, blue state, or et cetera, right, while always oversimplified, is far more oversimplified than it may seem because of the millions of voters who have been structurally prohibited from political participation. Right? So the 2000 election was famous for this, in Florida specifically, right? More than 1 million people who were prohibited from voting in the state that became the sort of base of where George Bush then became president. Right? But this has shaped elections and the electorate throughout the country. And that level of voter disenfranchisement is sort of slowly starting to fall. I think Amendment 4 is sort of the biggest challenge to it, and I actually think that Amendment 4 didn't go far enough, because it had several exclusions about who would get their voting rights restored. But I think we've seen similar things in Alabama that proved decisive in Doug Jones beating Roy Moore, the Senate seat, I think Virginia and elsewhere. Right? So the scope of voter disenfranchisement goes hand in hand with prison gerrymandering, right? Which is the use of counting people where they are incarcerated rather than where they are from for political apportionment. Why would that be a problem? Well, remember that map I showed you, right, that had all the dots of the different prisons and jails, right? Most of those are in primarily rural counties, much whiter counties, and they incarcerate people who are mostly Black and Latinx coming from major cities. But if people are counted where they are incarcerated rather than where they live, that gives a lot more power, right, to those rural, white, and typically more conservative counties. So again, prison becomes so fundamental to how the government thinks and how the government operates, right, that it becomes the sort of basis of political power. Okay? Again, needs to be attacked politically. So that's where I want to wrap up, okay, and just highlight a few things about what it would mean to actually move away from the carceral state, right, right, that the United States is and has been for quite some time. And I'll say, I prepared this talk a little bit ago, and then I've been here with my son, visiting my parents, and I have largely stayed away from news. And then last night, was looking and saw the First Step Act news, and was up late in a tweet storm about it. So we can talk more about it, right? But I haven't adjusted the talk for that, but it's on my mind when I lay these out. Okay? I want to talk about two broad principles that I think are significant, right? That I think need to be the kind of focus, more so than what many reform agendas put forward, right? And we can sort of revisit this in more detail in discussion. So the first is that we need to reduce the size, scale, and scope of what is mostly a public prison system, right? And of how the government thinks through crime and punishment. So this means several things, right? It includes district attorneys, and there have been a number of very significant battles over district attorneys, right? Because along with the police, the district attorney is the kind of front line of mass incarceration. It's the district attorney who decides what to charge someone with, right? So whether you could do the same thing in one county and get 5 years in prison, and do it in the next county over and get 50 years in prison. Right? That's wholly dependent on the district attorney and the decisions that they make. Now you can do something, right, in some counties, right, and get no prison time or get life in prison, right, depending on the district attorney. So there's been a number of, I think, very profound campaigns to recognize the tremendous power, right, the tremendous discretion that district attorneys have, and to try and institute progressive change at that level. I think Philadelphia, to my mind, really stands out there, elected a civil rights defense attorney, lifelong defense attorney, to the DA position about a year ago, and has done tremendous work moving away from cash bail, moving away from low-level drug offenses, prosecuting low-level drug offenses or sex work. Right? These are things that make tangible difference in people's lives. Another issue, right, is sentencing and judicial reform. If you think about an end to what is increasingly being called death by incarceration. So there's a lot of talk about ending the death penalty. A number of states now either have moratoriums on the death penalty or outright bans on the death penalty. And yet what has often taken its place has been death by incarceration, which is life without parole sentences. These are, people who've been sentenced to things at 17, 18, 21 years old, and are still there 50, 60, 70 years later. What a number of emerging research in criminology and biology show is that the human brainstem is not fully developed until you're around 26 years old. Part of why that's important is that most people who are incarcerated for things that they've done as young people. So what this research has pointed to is that people, if people are sort of physically or sort of biologically not as mature, right, why are we holding a 15-year-old or a 24-year-old responsible for in the same way as a 50-year-old? So there's been a number of, I think, really significant challenges to death by incarceration that actually can reduce the prison population, right, and the severity of punishment in the U.S. far more successfully than other things. I think a focus on ending the Prison Litigation Reform Act and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and a number of other restrictions that have been passed. Both of those come from the 1990s in the Clinton administration. What the Prison Litigation Reform Act did was make it significantly harder for incarcerated people to sue. And so their ability to improve their conditions, their ability to get any kind of post-conviction relief for wrong misconduct during their trial has been significantly limited. Some of you may have seen the Making a Murderer series on Netflix. They actually talk about the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act in the new season, right? It's part of the issue that's going on there. But there are hundreds of thousands of people, right, who have been affected by not having recourse to the law. right? That they can't fight through the law to change their conditions or to fight their sentence, right? As a result. The other thing that I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to, right, again, is adjacent to the private prison conversation. It's this idea of incarceration, right, which is how prison systems are expanding, often through private companies, right, so that you're not incarcerated in a bricks and mortar facility, but you can't leave your house and you have an ankle monitor on. These are things that first step act does a lot of, but that a number of states have done to try and reduce their prison population in very cynical ways, right? So that they're spending less on prison and they don't have this sort of bricks and mortar institution, but they're not necessarily changing the rate of people who are subject to the criminal justice system. Right? I think we need to be very attentive to the growth of punishment through these other means, through surveillance and monitoring, again, which are often done by these companies like Securus, right? These sort of communication companies that specialize in these sort of punitive justice projects. Ultimately, the conversation that we're having about how we end mass incarceration is about having fewer police and less prisons. And I think at a certain point, that's just where the rubber meets the road. There's no way around that. Most of the money that's spent on prisons is spent on running the physical institutions. Right? Prisons are resource-intensive institutions to heat and to cool if they have air conditioning. A number of prisons, including in Florida and Texas, do not have air conditioning. But to keep the institution running, to keep the lights on, keep the sewer working, and to pay for the guard staff. So the best way to save money on prisons is not to reduce programs, as Governor Scott did. Right? The best way to save money on prisons is to stop having so many people in prison. Period. Likewise, right, part of the growth of mass incarceration is that police have been called to do more things than they had before, as other services went away. So things that used to perhaps get you sent to the principal's office might now get you arrested, right? If you have a police officer in your school. This is, as with everything else in the criminal justice system, this is things that were applied and have been applied with the most force in poor communities of color, but are then generalized to other aspects of society as well. So I went to high school down the street at Spanish River High School. We had 2 police officers there, right, in the late 90s. One day, 2 kids were skipping school, and the officer pulled a gun on them. Now, unfortunately, nothing happened, but that's what happened. Right? That's the kind of thing that's going to happen when you have police in school. Because and it's not about the individual police officer, it's not about more diversity training or anti-bias training or body cameras or any of those things. Because what happens if the only tools you have at your disposal are a gun, a taser, and handcuffs, every problem is ultimately going to look like it can be solved with one of those tools. So there's no other way around that. Right? There's no amount of training that can make someone whose job is different than what that job is. So ultimately, the kind of horizon that I think we need to be moving towards, right, is how do we have fewer police? How do we not have police called to situations where someone's having a mental health crisis? How do we not have situations where prison is the only place where people who are in serious mental or emotional crisis or states of despair end up? That needs to be joined at the same time with a strategy that we might group as being community reinvestment. So that all that money that's being spent on prisons shouldn't then go to contracts with Securus so that more people can wear income monitors. Right? It should go into the things that keep people happy, healthy, and safe. And what things keep people happy, healthy, and safe? I think we can generate that list collectively rather easily. Right? Meaningful work, right? Time with family, food security, housing security. Things like universal health care or $15 an hour guaranteed minimum wage are things that would end mass incarceration. right, that can contribute to an end of mass incarceration. So the kinds of conversations that we have about other sort of social and political policy programs, we need to recognize our conversations about mass incarceration, even if no one is saying prison. And in fact, what's so, I think, dangerous about the moment that we've been in for the last several years is that conversations about prison reform have huddled around here, right? They've huddled at the level of more public-private partnerships, right? And conversations about other kinds of, at the national level, I think kind of inside the beltway conversations have huddled around incarceration. But the conversations that actually make the most significant difference are ones that are focused here. So we need to sort of merge those kind of policy conversations with ones around ending mass incarceration. Finally, I just want to acknowledge that these are not simply my ideas alone, things that I have been thinking up late at night. These are conversations that are actually in progress in a number of places, including in prison. Okay? So over the summer, and between August 21st and September 9th, we had a national prison strike that included several participation in Florida, where the participants created this kind of national set of demands that really speaks to what the kind of future of a sort of anti-carceral society might look like. So I encourage you, I'll leave this up here as we move through this discussion, but I encourage you to check out the demands and to follow a number of related efforts here. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions, comments, and so on.
Dan, you spoke about the police and their role in this. What do you have to tell us about the apparently increasing militarization of the police forces around the country?
Yeah, I mean that comes directly out of the war on crime. Signal element of Johnson's program was creating something called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which created these massive block grants that municipalities pursued in order to what has been called demilitarized. So that's when police departments started to acquire high-grade weaponry, and it's also when they started to acquire a lot more authority to use that high-grade weaponry. That's at the federal level. We also have a number of municipal police departments that are rather large agencies that were pursuing more and more ways of doing that. So as you have all these anti-drug laws, anti-gang laws, they all have these riders that gave police more and more money. So even a number of sort of prison reform bills have been premised on more money to the police, which goes into things like tanks and tear gas and other kinds of issues.
I was surprised to hear you talk about Amendment 4 and not Amendment A in Colorado.
That end of the yeah.
What does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so for people who aren't familiar with this, Colorado had a ballot initiative that ended that loophole of the 13th Amendment. And so it sort of took out that language about separate punishment for a crime. I think it was a grassroots victory in the sense that people organized for it and won on the ballot. But I don't think it's that significant. I think it's a symbolic victory. I think when you look at a number of prisoner rights lawsuits that have been settled on the state side, right, where the state has won against incarcerated people, almost never are they invoking the 13th Amendment. Right? There are a couple of instances where they are, but far more common, right, is that states win on institutional security grounds, right, which is to say that the court has said anything that protects the service, that protects the security of the institution is paramount. Right? So there's a case where prisoners from North Carolina were trying to form a labor union, right? And they lost, and that was the court's ruling. Had nothing to do with the 13th Amendment, right? Where slaves could not organize a union, right? right? In the 18th and 19th centuries. But that wasn't their ruling, right? The ruling was institutional security is paramount. So they weren't trying to work through the 13th Amendment to litigate their side. So one thing is they win on institutional security grounds. The other thing that they win on more, honestly, is the Eighth Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. So Fourth Amendment about rights, protection from unreasonable search and seizure, right? Often determined that incarcerated people or just criminalized people generally don't have that right? Right? That's where police power gets the benefit of the doubt, right? So it was a reasonable search and seizure, right? So therefore, the suit gets tossed, right? Eighth Amendment, very fascinating, right? Colin Diane wrote a really great, very short book called The Story of Cruel and Unusual that I recommend. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Sounds great, right? Why wouldn't we want that, right? But what legal scholars have what lawyers and judges have won on repeatedly is that it prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. So something can be cruel, okay? Something could be unusual and be totally fine. So in fact, right, the Fourth and Eighth Amendments are much more what states have relied on than the 13th to justify the prison conditions. So I'm glad it passed symbolically, right? I think it's a good thing, but I think it's largely symbolic. I don't think that affects most of prison rights litigation or just prison conditions. I don't think states care about a 13th Amendment, honestly. I mean, these days they don't care about the other side of the 13th Amendment, right? Much less they're not focused on the exemption.
My next question, just because the photos up, was just about the eye walk, but you already kind of touched on it a little bit.
Well, what did you think of the First Step Act and what it might look like if enacted?
Okay, I'm gonna try to restrain myself.
You know,
I have a lot of thoughts about it. I also have to write an op-ed about it this evening, so if you look on Truth Out tomorrow, you will have my less restrained response. But I think, I actually think it's sort of similar to Colorado, removing the exception from the 13th Amendment. I think it's largely a symbolic move. In terms of substantive changes, I think they're few and far between, for two reasons. One, look who's doing this. Two, the federal prison system is about 13% of the overall prison system. So most people are incarcerated not just in government-run facilities, but they're incarcerated at the state and local level. So most of the change that needs to happen at the state and local level. So this is a big show, it's a big performance, right? I think it's a very cynical performance by this administration. But they're looking at things like Amendment 4, they're looking at things like the moderate sort of reenfranchisement in Alabama, they're looking at the attacks on disenfranchisement in Virginia, and they're realizing that a party of explicit white supremacy that relies mostly on older conservative voters doesn't have a long future. And so they're trying to figure out how they can respond. There's not, a lot people on the left like to claim that we're ending, some people on the left, the center left, like to argue that ending disenfranchisement is going to help Democrats. But there's no sort of permanent rule that says that. And even though Black and Latinx people are disproportionately incarcerated, there's still a lot of white people that are prison. And depending on where you are, like in Washington State, the prison system is very racist, very disparate, but it's Washington State, so it's still 70% white. Right? So a lot of white people in prison. So these kinds of moves, I think, are an attempt to sort of create a wedge within the campaign for reenfranchisement, right? And to sort of steer it away from being a racial and social justice issue, and to sort of try and appeal to more conservative elements of formerly incarcerated people and things, to try and build out a more of a block. One more thing I'll say is that it's a lot of the e-carceration stuff as well, right? There's no talk about the Prison Litigation Reform Act. There's no talk about giving incarcerated people more legal rights, more legal protections. I think it's a cheap dig at Clinton without a lot of substance.
so how do you kind of steer the conversation back towards like the advocacy standpoint instead of the people who kind of caused the problem in the first place trying to be a part of the solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I put up that point about sort of fewer police and less prisons. Like, I think at a certain point we have to say that the people who cause the problem, people who maintain and uphold the problem, can't actually be the ones to implement the solutions because they're not invested in the solutions, right? So I think the demands that come from incarcerated people who are so often denied a seat at the table of policy making, right, is really significant. I think we have to sort of keep coming back to a grassroots perspective, not only in prison but also from communities, right? So the kinds of groups that that help, right, in the past even before, I think it is really profound. I think we need to sort of keep steering the conversation back to what racial and social justice advocates have been saying for years, right? For years. I think that to see sort of Chuck Grassley and Mark Holden and Newt Gingrich sort of present themselves as prison reformers it actually makes me physically ill. So I think there are people who've been working on this stuff for a long time, and I don't mean academics, right? Like that too. I think there's a number of directly affected people and communities, and so I think the answers are already there. Right? Yeah.
I really look forward to your op-ed and shootout.
Thank you.
But this might be a little bit of a more fundamental question, but a lot of the authoritarian response to all of this is, oh, these are criminals, they already forfeited their rights when they did a bad thing.
Yeah.
How do we respond to that?
Yeah. I mean, Brian Stevenson, who does the Equal Justice Initiative, and Sister Helen Prejean, who's been a long-time anti-death penalty advocate, they have a very wonderful kind of moral human rights language that says people are better than the worst thing they ever did. And I think that's one significant point. I think we can talk about how, I think we have to talk about the supreme unfairness, right, of the system from top to bottom. I also think sort of related to that is that anytime when you say someone is not a member of the political community, you have subjected them to the most cruelty that humans are capable of. Right? So I think, and this is why I think the limitations of a movement for saying that people who are convicted of murder or sexual offenses are still excluded, right? Even after they've done their time. Yeah. So I think personally there's no moral, legal, political reason that anyone should be denied. Like I even think that Donald Trump should deserve the right to vote. I don't care what people do, right? Anyone deserves the right to vote because that's what it means to live in society. Mm-hmm. And when you've said that people who are subject to society's laws have no formal personhood, right? Have no right to stand before the court, have no right to express their will at the ballot box, you have made possible genocide. Doesn't mean you've committed genocide, but you've made possible genocide. Okay? So I think the continuing operation of Guantanamo as this kind of legal black hole is exactly that's the end game of that narrative. Right? So to formally remove millions of people from any kind of political participation is to effectively write them out of society. Yeah. And I think that's immoral, it's unethical, it's inefficient, right? Yeah. I think across the board. I don't know, right? Doesn't mean you have to like a person to say that everyone deserves the right to vote. You agree with a person. Yeah.
Okay. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and stop at that. If those of you who might have some other questions.
Oh no, there was somebody behind you.
Okay, is there, probably we'll have some time maybe for a little bit more Q&A afterwards. I know some people have already had to leave, and I know others are going to be leaving because of class. But I want to thank Dr. Berger for coming today. And because of where we're situated in Boca, this is an issue that's very personal to a lot of people in this room, within FAU, within this community. And I think oftentimes, we talk about the analysis, but having some helpful suggestions of what people can do, it always comes back to grassroots activism to put pressure on political leaders and not allow them necessarily to come up with solutions. Is always helpful. So join me in thanking again Dr. Berger for some additional Q&A if you have some. So thank you for coming and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm looking for taking you. I put 8 books on the list that I have.
yeah. All right, so I'll see you around.
Alright, please.